your life have been your military training and your martial arts training. What would you say are the commonalities between the best BJJ athletes and the best special forces operators that you've worked with?
There's probably the biggest commonality between the two is some kind of strange contrast between being extremely disciplined and being extremely creative. So clearly, if you're going to get good at jiu-jitsu, you got to be disciplined enough to train all the time. Same thing with being in the military. If you're going to be a good operator, you have to have the discipline to push yourself in training. But you can't be a person that, leans so hard towards a disciplined, structured life that you don't have any creativity, because both in jiu-jitsu and on the battlefield, you definitely want to be creative and figure out creative solutions and things that people haven't thought of and things that the enemy is not going to think of or that your opponent's not going to think of. So you got to find that person who has a good balance between discipline and kind of a wild freedom, creativity that they can make adjustments.
It's interesting to think that more focus or more efficiency isn't always the solution to everything. So the analogy I'd use is, if you think about an artist's creative studio where they need their creativity, it's not orderly. There's half coffees and easels and sketches and paint and all sorts of stuff all over it. What does that engender? What's that environment creating for them? But then when they need to go and file their taxes, trying to file their taxes in that same room is probably not a good idea. And I guess that flip-flop between off and on, right, between focus and play, it seems like a very interesting thing to think about, especially in a military context. What does that mean when you're talking about a special forces operator being creative?
There's a certain level of, inside the military in general, is if you're you have to be a person that kind of follows the rules and stays within standards, and that's great. And you're gonna be a good, solid soldier if that's what you are. But if you have a mindset that's so highly disciplined and so highly structured, like I just said, then you're not going to think creatively when there's a problem that needs to be solved. So you want to have people that don't mind the discipline and can actually access the discipline in a way that they can utilize it, but you don't want people to be trapped by discipline. And it's the same thing in jiu-jitsu. If you have someone that only knows how to do a certain move and they can't think creatively about other ways to employ that, it's not that they're not going to be good, because they are going to be good, but they're going to reach limitations. And one of the interesting things in the SEAL teams is we didn't have, especially when I was coming up, we didn't have any doctrine whatsoever. There was no written doctrine of any kind. So everything that you learned was word of mouth. You learned from the guys that went before you. And that meant if the guys that went before you didn't really know what they were doing, you're probably learning a bad way. And if you didn't think objectively about it, then you might follow someone down a path that doesn't make any sense. So you ended up with a bunch of guys in the SEAL teams that were pretty open-minded, and they could kind of look at problems and figure out how to solve them. In the Army and the Marine Corps, they have doctrine for just about everything. This is how you do a raid. This is how you conduct an ambush. They had written doctrine for this. So if you didn't know how, you could just look at a book, which is actually a huge benefit for them. Because if I'm a new platoon commander and I don't know how to do an ambush, I can just look at this book and I can learn how to do it. And so there's some huge benefits to having a very disciplined doctrine that you can follow. But that's one of the odd advantages of the SEAL teams, is that since we didn't have any doctrine, we had to be a little bit more free thinking, and that made us a little bit more adaptive in some situations. So it's just like anything else. Your strength can be your weakness can be your strength, and you have to be aware. And if you're aware that it's a strength, and if you're aware that it can also be a weakness, and if you're aware that it's a weakness and you're aware that it can also be a strength, then you can probably optimize the way that you're going to think, which is pretty beneficial.
Do you think that can be trained, that creativity?
Yeah, I think creativity can be trained. It just like any other natural trait, some people are going to have more propensity to be creative than someone else, and some people are more rigid than other people in the way they think. And you can take someone that's more rigid and you can make them more creative, but everyone's going to have some kind of a limitation. And some people might have a pretty subdued limitation of how creative they're going to get. And some people can really be trained to get a lot better at that.
Where did you fall on that spectrum?
I would say I fell. I would say I fell pretty hard in both directions. So I was, a disciplined person that believed in structure, and I liked structure. And at the same time, I would definitely think of things in a different way. And I was a very rebellious kid, and I think rebellion could be somehow tied to creativity and looking at things and saying, hey, that doesn't make sense to me. So I'd say that I was a pretty strong degree of both of those things. And that's what made me who I am.
Well, especially the music that you listen to as well growing up, right? I don't think almost all of the kids that I know that grow up listening to metal or hardcore, you can't listen to that and not have a rebellious streak in you.
Yeah, you definitely can't listen to that and not have a rebellious streak in you. And that did kind of drive my way of thinking a lot when I was growing up. And not only did it drive my way of thinking, I think I found that kind of music because that's the way I was sort of engineered in the first place. So, yeah.
Who were you listening to? Who were you listening to when you grew up?
Bad Brains, Black Flag, Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags. Black Sabbath is my favorite band of all time. Yeah, those kind of bands.